Thanks for joining us for another MAHLE Motorsports tech presentation. We're going to begin a series of segments focusing on some common piston failures and issues and looking at the signs and symptoms that we use to diagnose them. But before we begin, let's take a minute to talk about the parts, the pieces, and the info that we require to better analyze these issues. Ideally, in most situations, we'd like to be able to look over your shoulder as the engine is being diagnosed or ran to see what the issues are and be there when you're disassembling it to see the parts as they come out of the engine, but realistically we can't. So the question is, how do we get as close to that as possible? The two keys are simply information and having the right relevant parts and pieces to analyze. The process starts with information. Initially, we're looking for the very basic description of the problem. If the issue wasn't catastrophic, what were the signs and symptoms that the engine was exhibiting? We also need to know how long the engine was run or what the mileage was. Same thing goes for usage of the engine. There's a pretty big difference between 30 miles, if that 30 miles is accumulated on a drag strip or in a sprint car, versus 30 miles in your street rod cruising down the highway. Both are information that can help us to get to the root of the issue. Furthermore, we're looking for specific details that are related to the actual failure. For example, if you have a scuffed piston, we're going to want to know what the original piston to wall clearance was when the engine was built. We're going to ask what type of oil was used, what type of fuel was run, and looking for any abnormalities in temperature or anything else that could potentially contribute to the problem at hand. We should also note that many issues can have multiple root causes. Sometimes the best that we can do is start to eliminate those causes one by one until we come up with the most probable scenario. So even results of tests or details that come up that may appear normal can have a useful part in the overall analysis. The second element is determining what parts to return. All too frequently, the only part that we get to see is the single component that had an issue or failed. In some cases, it's fairly obvious what happened. In others, not as much. In general, the more parts we get, the more complete the picture is that we have of what was going on in the engine, either leading up to the issue or at the time that the parts had problems. But clearly, we'll work with what we're given. And in cases where a bag of parts and shrapnel is all that we have to work with, that's where we start. But there's a lot that can be learned from what looks like a pile of scrap. For instance, separating out connecting rod pieces gives us very clear details of what the small end of the connecting rod looked like when the piston let go. Secondly, we've got two complete rod bolts. There's one type of failure or cause of failure eliminated. We have a complete pin. So already we've eliminated two potential causes for what happened to the piston. From there it becomes a little more tricky in terms of looking at surfaces that we can identify, starting to piece the piston together, looking for known features and determining if there's any distress. Again, signs or indications of what was happening with this part when it let go. We tend to analyze individual pieces looking for fracture surfaces. If a piece of metal snaps and breaks, it will leave a very distinct characteristic on the surface. But if that part is cracked and is fatigued over time, the appearance of the surface will be different. Both are key features that we look for as sifting while we're sifting through the parts and pieces that are available. Secondly, as we start to identify known pieces of the piston, we begin to put them back together to form the shape of the complete piston, looking for signs and indications again of what the running condition was for that part before the issue made itself present. In cases where looking at one single cylinder or the collection of parts isn't sufficient, that's where we fall back on, okay, what does the rest of the set look like? And that's the key to having parts and components available where we can start to rule out collateral damage and look for signs and symptoms on other pistons or other cylinders that may show indications of what was happening. For instance, if we had a cracked part, ultimately we're going to want to check every other piston in that same location to look for similar cracks or the starts of cracks that may not have propagated as far. For scuffing issues, we're going to want to know, was it isolated to one cylinder, or was it on one engine bank, or was it every piston, random, etc. All of those small details begin to add up into a growing picture of what the final conclusion will be. Short of having everything to look at, which is admittedly a luxury in many cases, pictures can be useful. Admittedly, it's very difficult to determine root causes from a few fuzzy photographs, and a lot of these details that we're looking for are difficult to zoom in on, focus, and get good quality pictures of. But to give you a very quick example, we were fighting a engine with blow-by sealing issues. We had all 8 pistons, rings to look at, saw some very noticeable wear, but could not determine exactly what the root cause was. Customer happened to send us, after the fact, some additional photos that showed the scoring or scuffing that was occurring in the cylinders. Looking at that photo, saw very quickly that there was absolutely no crosshatch in that cylinder, and potentially a very rough cylinder. Suddenly everything we were seeing on the pistons and rings came into focus. We found out what his problem was, fixed the block. Lastly, let's touch briefly on how to return the parts. It seems very basic, but it's something that we continually see issues with. Number one, we do want the parts to be clean. We don't want anything that would potentially mask issues and signs that we're looking for on the parts. The default is to leave them dirty. If there's ever any question, it gives us the best and clearest picture of how the parts came out of the engine. Secondly, we want to see parts and components numbered or labeled, particularly looking at position in the engine, trying to determine if there are trouble cylinders, if it's front or back of the engine, one side versus the other. Knowing location of each part and where it was in the engine can be useful, particularly on scuffing issues where we'll want to isolate thrust side from anti-thrust side of the piston. Knowing the piston or cylinder number is crucial to do that. So having the parts labeled and identified correctly is important. A question with a less clear-cut answer is determining whether to completely disassemble the parts or to leave them in some state of assembly as they came out of the engine. The answer ultimately is going to rely on the nature of the failure and particular issue that we're trying to resolve. For example, with an oil consumption issue, knowing how the rings are oriented on the piston, or being able to look at end gaps, or in searching pin issues, clip issues, seeing parts and how they're assembled, the fit of the parts can be very useful. The downside of having a fully assembled part is packaging, and care in packaging and protecting the parts during shipping becomes crucial. Speaking of shipping in general, all too often this is the first thing that we see and hear when we get parts sent back for analysis. It's absolutely crucial that we be able to distinguish between damage that occurred while the engine was running, or nicks, scrapes, dings that may have happened while the part was being shipped back to us. We've talked about analyzing individual surfaces and looking for directional marks and how the parts failed. It becomes very difficult to do that when you're unable to distinguish where that damage originally came from. In brief summary, the more information, the better off we are to start. Secondly, the more parts that we can look at, the better our chances are of getting to the root of the issue. Ultimately, our goal is to help you identify what happened and to help prevent reoccurring issues. And having those two keys met helps us to do that job better. Thanks for watching, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and YouTube as we roll out more in-depth videos on specific piston issues and their analysis.